So, some videos and some topics are easy to work out what you're going to do. For example, when I know this video is, in terms of Saturday deployment, when it comes out as a long patrol, is going to come out on the 7th of December, it makes for a certain topic. It does make for a certain topic. Now, this is being recorded back in July, though, because, well, and I say this in the nicest of ways, I'm trying to get my recordings functioning done a lot earlier to improve things. So, apologies for not wearing a Santa shirt, basically, or a Christmas shirt in the recording of this video. I should have thought. I will try for future ones. Now, when we're talking about Pearl Harbor, when we're talking about the attack, there are many, many different stories which go around it in terms of planning, and this video is all about the operation and the planning that goes into it. Not about what actually happens, not about the results, not about the long-term consequences, it's about the planning. And I'm going to do something a bit different, because I'm going to do first half before the Shameless book plug is all going to be about the Japanese planning and what they did, what they were thinking about, how they're approaching it, how the planning process they went through. Then I thought I'd flip it on its head, because maybe after the Shameless book plug we'd look at how the Americans might have done it if they'd been planning the attack. And the reason I did want to do that was because some of the reasons why the American analysis of what the Japanese are doing fails, and fails to see what's coming. And it is hubris, by the way. It's never put down to conspiracy theory what you can put down to humans being humans and having hubris. That humans can be willfully stupid in the name of hubris. They really can be. So, in nicest way, this happens. But in the case we're talking about, in the scenario we are talking about, how would the Americans have been attacking Pearl Harbor if they're going to attack it? Because that's relevant to them spotting the signs the Japanese are going to attack Pearl Harbor. And the fact is, they would have approached it from a very different way. So if we spend the time after the Shameless book plug looking at what the American operations were, the exercises where they did attack Pearl Harbor, and how these things came about, I thought that'd be a pretty good use of our time, and a pretty interesting video. So here it is. But we're starting off with the Japanese. We're starting off with why attack Pearl Harbor in the first place? How do the Japanese conceive of Pearl Harbor as a target to attack? Now, the interesting thing about Hawaii and Pearl Harbor is that it is not always the naval base it becomes. In fact, for a long period of time in this period, and for most of this period, it is definitely not the naval base it becomes. Now, I would argue that I am incredibly suspicious, and as we get into, of when the Japanese claim they begin planning operations, when some of the records suggest they do, and some people remember, oh, we started talking about this at this point. I'm fairly sure it was earlier than any of them like to admit to. And that's fine. That's history. It's sometimes the way it is. People might not have been involved in it. They might not want to recollections may vary, all these things. But the thing is, even before it becomes a major naval base, it is a critical fulcrum around which the Pacific is going to bend. It is this island chain where you can find fresh water in the middle of the Pacific, which is a vast ocean. It is therefore a natural logistics hub for fleets. It is a natural organization point for fleets. It is something they can regularly find, they can readily support and sustain themselves from, as long as it's been built up and the infrastructure has been supplied. One of the interesting things about the Japanese is they consistently overestimate how much of investment the Americans have made in the islands. There is a lot of accusations about the number of spies and things they have going to Hawaii, the information they're getting out of Hawaii, and they are surely getting some. They really are. But one of the things that consistently comes back is that the Japanese are overestimating, because them, it seems only sensible that they should be investing in this space. This should be a natural space, kind of like the Philippines, etc., that the Americans should be investing in order to sustain their global reach. Unfortunately, the one thing you can usually take for fact is that the US Congress will penny pinch wherever they can. They will. They'll penny pinch in the weirdest of ways. They will spend millions of pounds, well, millions of dollars, I suppose, is a more accurate thing of, millions of dollars buying something, and then demur overspending a few $100s to properly support and sustain it infrastructure-wise. If they have to spend $1,000 on a concrete, they'll be complaining, and they'll probably try and buy the cheaper concrete. They'll mandate you pay less, so you end up buying the cheaper concrete, which wears out more quickly, and needs to be replaced more quickly. It is not a new problem. It's not an old problem. There is a reason why so much of the World War II infrastructure is still used for military capabilities in the world today. So much of World War II built infrastructure, because then there was enough budget to build it properly. And no one was going to demur about building it properly in the middle of a major war. And that's why most of the major runways these days are, especially for air bases, etc., around Europe and even to extent America, are ones which are repaired, relayed runways which were already existing in World War II, which were built in World War II. Because they were done properly the first time, and therefore to renew and upgrade them properly, you can make a better argument for it. That's why building new air bases, despite the arguable need for dispersion and the arguable need to orientate forces and maybe to try and give ourselves a slightly broader protection profile, tends to fall on deaf ears, because they don't want to build proper runways. So the Pacific and Pearl Harbor are important. This means that everyone's looking at Pearl Harbor, and Pearl Harbor has many advantages. It's a lovely natural harbor with a natural island in it. Everything's nicely organized. There's a lot of nice space here. There's a lot of facilities you can build on this. It's got an easily securable way in, way out. You can protect the fleet quite well in there. All these things are good. But it's still a harbor. And as good as it is, it's dependent upon what you're investing in it, what you'll be able to get out from it. And with the Japanese keeping a very close eye on it, they start to develop ideas. Now, this is getting to what I've already alluded to. When did Japan start planning? Now, this is the fun question, and I've already alluded to it, but it is a fun question, because you see, there are many people, we're going to be talking about the people involved in planning of the Pearl Harbor operation, and there are many of them who claim they were the originators of the idea, and I honestly think they're both right and wrong. I think they originated versions of the idea, I really do, but I think the concept started earlier. And let me give you the reason for this. It's quite simple. The Japanese are heavily involved in the British naval war effort. Even if they're not supplying ships, they are involved in that. Their attaches are watching, liaising, talking. They've got people watching on the ships. They've got people wandering around Britain, taking part and observing things. And they are very much plugged into what the British were planning to do to Wilhelmshaven. They know what the British carried out in Cuxhaven on the 25th of December 1914. They know what the British were developing Sopwith Cuckoos for. They actually procure themselves. They are looking at it from a similar perspective. And both fleets have a long history of attacking opponents in harbour. Both the Royal Navy and the IJN. And both of them are looking at us. And you have to remember, the Japanese had actually carried out the first air attacks of the war. The first air attacks on ships, etc., had been carried out by the Japanese. So I think probably, as far as the Japanese were concerned, almost as soon as they had a carrier, they had an idea for how to plan how to attack certain American installations from the air using a carrier. I think probably it's more something which becomes firm after the Washington Naval Treaty, because that is really the point at which the IJN starts going, well, we didn't get our 70%. So we need to be secure. We need to be prepared. Remember, the Washington Naval Treaty, the Americans won the battle with the Japanese to ensure they didn't get a 7-10 ratio. They didn't get their 7-10 ratio. And they won it. That made them very happy. The Japanese had a 3-5 ratio instead of 7-10. Unfortunately, that made the Japanese feel chronically weak and made them permanently in the mindset of, we are now exposed. We need to think of ways around this. We need to think of ways to adapt to being this exposed. We're in a weak position. And the trouble is, when you put someone into such a weak position and such a mindset, they're never going to be your friend. They're never going to be able to work with you. They're never going to be that viable person for you to consult with and discuss with. They just aren't. And so, whilst, as mentioned, Hawaii itself wasn't that big and a bigger base at this point, I think pretty much as soon as it started getting larger, started going up in importance, it was starting to get attention. Now, I think, like the Americans, there is a difference of what Japan's planning to do with their carriers when they just have the Hosho, like the Americans when they just have Langley, versus when they have the Kaga and the Akagi. Having those two carriers gives you a very different perspective on operations than having Hosho. And that's probably at which point they start considering this sort of strike operation. But like the Americans, they end up working that up. And I think the debate is, yes, we have these plans, but are they part of our actual operational plan? Are they part of something we're actually going to select and turn into a mature operational concept we're going to deliver on? Or are they like the British war plans for Italy, where the Royal Navy seems to have plans for attacking Taranto sitting in with aircraft sitting in the cupboard from about 1926 onwards? They have something sitting in the Mediterranean carriers plan box, a nice little sort of plan of how to attack Taranto, and periodically it's taken out and updated. Periodically they do major works to revise and upgrade it, but, it's sitting there. And then you come to World War II and the British pull it out, add in all the latest information, all the latest intelligence, and turn it into look at what they actually have available in terms of aircraft, and turn it into an actual proper plan. I think that is what we're talking about. I think the Japanese have an ongoing concept of operations that they always have a few months away from being a viable plan. A couple of months away of intense staff work and intelligence work to turn into a proper plan. So let's look at the principal characters involved of the actual plan, which is carried out in 1941. Now, as you can see, there are a fair number of people involved here. There are a fair number of people involved, and they all have interesting stories to tell. And this is one also the interesting debates you get about when you're talking about the number of waves at Pearl Harbor, because there is the concept, and, Kaigan Chusa, that's equivalent to roughly rank of commander, Minoru Genda, and while I'm here and talking about Japanese ranks, I did a video on Chusa Nagumo the other day, and it's got a bit of an introduction to ranks in it, into the Japanese ranking system and some translations of names. I'm planning on long term doing a whole video on that topic, a whole video on the topic of ranks and going through the ranks of different nations and, American, British, etc., where all the ranks come from. I just need to find some more sources for that, especially for the French ones for some reason. Finding a decent book about the French ranks is an interesting task. I have no idea why. But the thing is, with these officers, they each have their own part to tell in the story. Now, Minoru Genda, he recollects first discussing the idea of the attack in 1934. Please note that when we're talking about the attack, we're going to say the official planning begins in early 1941. Genda says at least 1934. There are others who refer to earlier discussions and earlier points of view. So, again, this is the thing of, are we talking about the specific operational plan for that attack, or a carrier strike on Pearl Harbor? I think if we're talking about the latter phraseology, you're talking a lot earlier. And he was used as a sounding board by both Yamamoto and Onishi. Now, if we work up, we then have Kaigan Taiza, that's roughly equivalent to Captain, Kamite Kurishima, Yamato's Chief of Staff and Key Planning Officer, this gentleman. And he is the officer who is in many ways bringing together the logistical side and the whole overall plan and making sure all the different sections slot together. He has a predilection which does affect Yamamoto's strategy quite often in terms of liking small task forces. And this comes out of the Japanese raiding attrition doctrine, which they have been developing for years as one of their methods of equalizing against larger forces. They realise it's not really going to do more than buy them time, but hoping it's going to attrit enough that they can use that time to their advantage. And hopefully attrit enemy forces down to the level at which they can actually actively combat them. Then you have Kaigan Shosho, or Ryunosuke Kuusuke, the guy in the middle there. He was Commander 24th Air Flotilla and later Chief of Staff of the Kido Butai. That's roughly equivalent to Rear Admiral rank, and he is the person who takes the plan to its final form, and is therefore the person in charge of planning. He is a very experienced air officer. This is one of those things when we start talking about the senior officers in charge, the vice admirals, etc., and the various task force commanders, people go, they don't have carrier experience, they do. The people doing the planning, they will have the relevant experience. You're talking about someone who is a manager of an overall formation, overall force accomplishing something, which has lots of different capabilities built into it. And this is one of those things which you sometimes have to go is like, you don't necessarily need the admiral in charge of a task group, even as a carrier battle group, to be a carrier officer, to be an aviator. They don't need to have that experience. They can be a submariner, they can be a surface warfare specialist, as long as they have the right staff around with them and they have the training and the familiarity to understand what those staff are requesting of them, they can work it. And having Ryunosuke Kuusuke as your chief of staff and etc., the guy who comes up with the plan, who does a lot of the final detailing of the planning, yeah, it's good. Above that, at the top there, we have, of course, Kaigan Shosha, Rear Admiral Tanakero Onishi, head of the Aviation Development Division in Ministry of Munitions. According to some accounts, was possibly an originator of the plan, or at least the first person to propose the idea, or of the idea of the plan. He was then put in charge of gathering all of the information which was required by the plan. By the time he put the information together, he became very much opposed to the plan, and so he gets moved to go command the 11th Air Fleet from that point. But he's a Rear Admiral, he's an experienced officer. And then we have Kaigan Taicho, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, CNC Combined Fleet, threatened to resign in order to get permission to put the plan together. And this is where we have all these people involved in the planning. They're all pushing through an idea of a plan, what it's going to be, how it's going to be. And I think this is also one of the reasons why you have ultimately a plan for Pearl Harbor, which is both quite a capable plan, quite a flexible plan, but also a plan which takes in all these different accounts into view but is in many ways also not as defined as some might like in order to answer some of the questions people have about it. It really isn't. All these people have views and importance, and whilst, yes, these are the people, Yamato and the two off to the side, the two rear admirals and the admiral, are making the decisions, are really making the decisions. There are a lot of staff officers like the captain and the commander who are feeding into that, who are feeding in their ideas, and so when they say things like, oh, we should have launched a third wave, or we were going to be doing this, you have to listen to them, because that might have been something which was discussed. It might well have been a part of the planning process. As said before, when I talked about the third wave at Pearl Harbor, various videos, my view is, considering the bomb loadout they have left and the bomb loadout that they can put on the aircraft, is going to be an anti-infrastructure / anti-cruiser attack, because that would make sense. But the thing is, the moment they're not the aircraft carriers in Pearl Harbor, the Japanese aren't going to launch that third wave, because they're going to keep their aircraft back in case they find the aircraft carriers and have to attack them at sea. Because that's what you do. You don't risk yourself doing that. You launch the first two waves, which are going to be a surprise, but your third wave is A, going to be made up of aircraft which are returned from your first wave and any spare aircraft you decide to activate, and B, it's only going to go in if you're already sure that you're not going to get hit back and you're not going to have to deal with possibly any counterattack. If not, you keep it back. It makes sense as a doctrine, third wave, and that's why, of course, there'd then be a debate of whether it was safe to launch a third wave. Well, we don't know where the carriers are. Yes, but they're not here because all we do is responded, so let's attack. And you can see the room for manoeuvre and debate in that scenario, but it also makes sense. With that being said, let's consider the Japanese concept of operation. Now, the key point of the operation was secrecy. Secrecy was the principle of all this of the whole operation. The idea of managing to sneak to a position where you're close enough to Pearl Harbor to launch a devastating attack. Now, this is one of the reasons why I think this plan starts out earlier. Because, honestly, the Japanese have some interesting ideas for how to employ single carriers when they only have single carriers. There is a great line from Genda in his publication that he was one of the first and only people to think about multi-carrier operations. No, pretty much everyone's thinking about multi-carrier operations. Once they have enough carriers in service to think about multiple carrier operations, they are thinking about multi-carrier operations. The British go so far as to design their entire carrier system around multi-carrier operations. That is the whole principle of the British carrier philosophy in the 1930s. The Americans prefer multi-carrier operations. The Japanese are looking at a whole force carrier construct realistically. But everyone has been working up and thinking about the fact that, they need to do this strike and they need to use multiple aircraft, because the thing is, you use multiple aircraft because of the accuracy. You see, what kills a target is not hitting it with a certain amount of explosives, it's getting a certain amount of explosive in certain spots. And every miss, every time you hit somewhere which isn't a critical spot, all these things add up. So the more aircraft you can have involved, the more you can guarantee a hit. So you want to take as many carriers as you can, but secrecy is the key thing. The key thing. So you need to chart a course which is going to go around the major shipping lanes, which is going to allow you to avoid them. Because whilst there aren't the number of merchant ships with radios that you have today, and communication systems you have today, and by the way, for people who want a bit of an update on that one for reference, in the Falklands War, all the ships, and not all the ships taken up from trade, actually had radio communications gear of a sort which would enable them to actually transmit and receive instructions. So the Royal Navy had to resort to dropping chits from the helicopters. So the helicopters would fly over, drop little pieces of, well, blackboard pieces, which had chalk writing on them. We're literally doing that to pass out instructions to some merchant ships. Imagine what it was like with the merchant ships in the 1920s and 30s, 50, 60 years previously. Yeah. So, there is not a massive chance if a merchant ship spots you of it telling everyone it's seen you coming, but there is a chance, and there is especially a chance if it's a more modern one, a better one, or a bigger, fancier one like a liner or something like that, it might well make some noises. So you want to avoid the major shipping routes and avoid anywhere you're likely to run into such vessels. You are going to need to take enough of a force that if you bump into the enemy, you have a chance of dealing with it. Because the worst case scenario for the Japanese is if they bump into the US Navy out having a full fleet operation with live ammunition to the north of the Hawaiian Islands, and the Japanese bump into them a day early. And they bump into literally the full American fleet out doing exercises and battle drills. That is a very real risk. So you need to have enough force that if you run into that, you can get out of there. Because you are taking such a big force that you don't want to run any risks you can avoid of losing it. And this is usually the problem. Once you need to take a certain size force to go and do a job, you end up needing to take an even larger force to make sure that force can get back. Because if you're taking 6 of your precious aircraft carriers, and they don't have oodles and oodles of them at this point, they never have oodles and oodles of them, then you've got to be sure you're going to get those back. You need them. The attrition operations, the other operations, all depend on carriers. So yeah, they have a lot of planning documents, they have a lot of developments, and it's planned as you launch 2 waves, kind of like the modern system of missile firing. You fire 2 shots, and then you check. Get the information back, and you decide if to launch the 3rd wave or a 4th wave. A 3rd wave would have been within Japanese doctrine and established practice. A 4th wave would not have been out of it. Doing 2 waves only on such a strategically important target as Pearl Harbor is unusual, but again, it makes sense if your criteria is where are the aircraft carriers. That's just part of it though. The real concept and cornerstone of this plan is, and I know this is going back to the beginning, is secrecy. This is supposed to be done in a fashion which, well, some believe could be deniable in terms of if we can pull them back at any way, point along the route, and no one can claim we're going to do it. It's more supposed to be done in secrecy to buy them time for maximum damage. They don't want the enemy, in terms of the US, to be actually prepared for them to hit at all. They want to be able to get there and attack them with maximum force. So everything is based upon secrecy and force and range. You need to be able to get there. So that's what they're structuring their force around. That's what they're structuring their operation around. To be able to get close, hit their target, hit them hard, preferably find their carriers and their capital ships all alongside, and do a severe blow to them. They do have other targets. They do have other orders of priority. But those are what they want to take out first. And this is because, despite what you might read in some modern papers when they're talking about escort numbers, etc., a balanced force is always the strongest naval force you can put together, like a balanced force is the strongest force you can build for a land operation, etc. You know, it's going to have a mixture of tanks, of mechanized infantry, motorized infantry, artillery, logistics, engineering, all those things. This is the same with a fleet. So you need the aircraft carrier, and you need the destroyers and the frigates. You can't deal with just one or the other, because it's going to give you an unbalanced force. It's going to give you weaknesses. Your aircraft carrier provides your long-range strike and your outer air defense. It's really useful for that. Along with your reconnaissance, airborne early warning, and outer ASW. All sorts of things it provides. But it is useless without the escorts, and the escorts without it, they're constantly running from under other people's umbrellas, other carriers' umbrellas. And in this scenario, for the Japanese to come in and focus on the American capital ships and the American carriers makes sense. If you can hit them first and take them out, you can hollow out the American force. Suddenly they are left with cruisers, of which a large number of those cruisers are, let's be honest, scout cruisers, which were built under the first Washington Naval Treaty when you could build as many cruisers as you liked, and so they built a load of 8-inch scout cruisers because, well, they needed things for the reconnaissance force. They needed scout cruisers to make it work. And then suddenly the London Treaty goes, everything with 8-inch guns is now a heavy cruiser. The Americans are looking at the Pensacola's and going, sorry. Because the Pensacola's are not a heavy cruiser. They're just not. They are lovely cruisers. They've got 8-inch guns. But they were designed as a scouting cruiser. That's what they were built for. And they're very good for that role. They're not a heavy cruiser. They're not built to fight other cruisers. But there again, it's hard to argue that any treaty cruiser was really built to fight other cruisers. But the thing is, if the Japanese can knock out the center or the core of the American force, then they can run the war for a while. And again, the Japanese policy and Japanese belief was very much you'd fight a battle and then you'd have a negotiated peace. Their whole scenario on their doctrine where they would attrit an enemy back to the point in which they got to close enough to Japan and they were in a small enough force they could then do a Kantai-Kessen decisive battle, annihilate them, and then have a negotiated peace. They never thought they could win a long war versus America or Britain and the Commonwealth. They really didn't. Britain and its empire. They knew they had, those two groups had infrastructure and oodles of ships on their side and all sorts of mass on their side. So they know they can't win a long war with them. Their idea is to attrit them and annihilate them enough, do enough damage of their forces that they force them to negotiate. Now, of course, when you consider the American and British policies when it comes to these things, the odds of match, you're sitting down and negotiating is very, very low. They'd probably just turn up with even more forces later on. But that was the Japanese plan because that's their only option. They know they can't win a long-term war. They have to get a short, sharp, successful war, which puts them in a good position for a negotiation, because that's their only path they have to success. Anything which goes long, anything which lasts any amount of time, they know they do not have the infrastructure resources to sustain. And this operation is part of that plan. It's put forward. It's basically, can we attrit them in one blow? And I would argue it starts out as a plan to try and start off this whole luring the Americans to come out of anger, because it's only anger when you're not thinking logically. You're going to let your forces be attritted to the point at which the Japanese can do a Kantai-Kessen versus you. And keep charging, not go, right then, we've got this far. Look at all the destroyers and the things we've lost. Let's pause here while we get more reinforcements to come up and those sort of things. That's what you do sensibly. You only go on if you're angry, if you're motivated by emotion, if you're not thinking logically. And the Americans had war-gamed this, so they knew that wasn't the case. They knew that wasn't the sensible idea to do. Which is what ultimately makes all that planning kind of interesting, because the Japanese have very much gone down the route of, well, we win if it goes this way. But they know they don't win if it goes any other way. So they don't really have a long-term strategic plan. They have a load of hopes. Now we have to look at the force structure, which is going to be exercising this operation, what they are taking with them for the operation, because they do leave stuff behind. Now what they're leaving behind, let's be honest, the Hosho and the Zuiho, not particularly massive assets. The Ryuju, the Toyo, again, not particularly massive assets. The Hinyo and the Junyo wouldn't even commission until 1942, so they're not really an option. But the thing is, there is some selection going on here, and that tells a lot about the planning operation, because if it's been a suicide run, then you would have probably taken the 3rd and 4th Carrier Division. Because if you are going to lose anything, you prefer to lose those assets. those are your weakest assets. They can launch a single strike. Is it going to be a great strike? No. But you'd take them along because, again, they'd be your sacrificial things. You'd chuck them away. You'd use them. You don't want to lose any ship, but if you are going to lose anything, those ones are fairly high up on your list of, well, if I have to lose, I'll take this. When it comes to the divisions they do take with them, they take the 1st, the 2nd, and the 5th. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiru, Shikaku, and Zukaku. Now, Shikaku and Zukaku are pretty darn good carriers. While Soryu and Hiru are arguably the best of the Japanese purpose-built pre-World War II carriers, and please note I am saying pre-World War II carriers, I would often argue that Shikaku and Zukaku, these two vessels, both completed in late 1941, August and September 1941, are critical assets for the IJN. And to actually turn the strike from being that kind of raid where it's going to bait the Americans into charging after them into something which could actually deliver destructive power, whilst not a Kantai-Kessen, not a decisive battle to level destruction, but a level destruction which is going to destabilize the American war effort and permanently put, well, not permanently, even considering their ability to construct, but at least cripple their ability to project concentrated, balanced naval force for the next year to 2 years. That is what the Pearl Harbor is turned into. And it's turned into because of the Shikaku class. Because these are some beautiful, beautiful ships. Each carrying roughly the same number of aircraft. Roughly the same number of aircraft. 72 plus 12 spares. 12 spare aircraft, 72 aircraft. 27 Aki D3As, 27 Nakajima B5Ns, and 18 Mitsubishi A6M Zeros. They are good ships. And the whole structure of the force going to Pearl Harbor is built around these vessels. It's built around this force. When you start to look at what is going on, what the carriers are, what the force around them is, it's all built around supporting these carriers, these 6 vessels. They have the Hei and the Kirishima, 2 of their Kongos, as escorts. They also have the Tone and the Chikuma, 2 heavy cruisers as escorts. Those heavy cruisers are also their reconnaissance heavy cruisers. In other words, they carry a lot of seaplanes. And then you have a whole destroyer squadron. 3 divisions of destroyers and a light cruiser. Now, some of them are dispatched off to other things. Some of them take part in other areas, but realistically, this is a very focused force. It's got enough force to launch a surprise attack and fight its way away if it has to. It's got enough force to deliver the blow. It's not a force which you want to actually having fighting a battle. If this force is pounced upon by an enemy surface force, it's going to get into serious trouble very quickly. You think of any of the American fast battleships, e.g. both North Carolina and Washington had been commissioned in April and May 1941. If they and some cruisers and destroyers had been out doing a surface action exercise, again, above Hawaii, and this group, the group of ships which, is making up the Kido Butai, the strike force heading towards Hawaii, had bumped into them, they'd have wrecked them. They would have. So one of the things you have to have carrying on with the force is almost a constant reconnaissance. You have to have a constant air patrol and flow of information to try and gather things. This is what makes the storms on the trip quite so dangerous. Because storms are perfect times, especially when you consider how light the Japanese aircraft were, for American surface forces to bump into them. So in some ways the Japanese are running a massive risk running this light. But again, it's a compromise because you need a light enough force you can sneak in. You need a long range enough force you can support it at that range. It needs to have enough endurance, enough as the book applies. But you also need a large enough force it can, if it needs to, defend itself, which is why the two Congos are there. It's there to try and provide it with some measure of protection should it run across a cruiser group. Anything bigger than a cruiser group, it's in trouble. It's in a lot of trouble. And so, let's consider Pearl Harbor and the plan of attack. Now I have to admit, whenever I look at this plan of operations, this concept of operations that comes into the whole thing for the attack on Pearl Harbor, what always strikes me is this image. It's the routing. It's the fleet operations, what they're doing, how far north they're going, how far out of their way they're going to try and keep away from being spotted. Secrecy was key. Secrecy was critical. But they were turning up with enough force to do enough damage. That was the plan. Turning up with enough force to do enough damage. Now, the really interesting thing to me in this scenario is that with all this, and with all the time they devote to it, they haven't actually done the research they need to do. They haven't done the research they need to do. I've talked about this with the Royal Navy. And with torpedoes. Before. I go and grab my torpedo. So, when we're talking about aerial torpedoes, you have to do a lot of balancing in them for starters, but they found that didn't work enough. And then you added extender fins on the SN to try and improve their glide, because the trouble is torpedoes have a habit of being quite nose heavy, and so when they hit the water they tend to hit at that angle, dive deep, and in shallow water that means they hit the ground rather than hitting the top. No, you do not get a plate of a torpedo. You don't. Now, if they hit the bed, if they hit the ocean floor, if they hit the harbour floor, that's not good. That's not useful. You want them to run. Now, the British solved this by adding in a tension wire, which adds just enough tension onto the nose. It's going down that the torpedo belly flops, or approximately belly flops. It's sometime if it's not dropped from the right height, it will actually be slightly down, but that's not going to affect it as much as going at that angle or that angle. So this is the problem realistically for the Japanese. If they're going to go into this attack and they're going to rely so much on their torpedo bombers to do this operation, if they've been thinking about this as a primary operation for quite a while, why haven't they put more into developing their torpedoes? Why are their torpedoes still orientated around open ocean operations and open ocean strikes? Because in the ocean you have greater depth, so it doesn't matter if the torpedo dives down and pops up. It doesn't matter. It's got the space to come up. Well, that's the problem. You see, this to me smacks of why I think this operation was originally planned perhaps a raid, and had been something they've been working on, but was never really a focal operation, because we know what they do when they have a focal operation. We know how much effort they put into it. They gather together a crew, a group of specialists, like this crew of officers, especially the types of like Takahara or Onishi, who will go and do a massive amount of research and development to develop the weapon systems they need for that operation. But they don't. So to me, this operation comes about because the Japanese realize that no amount of raid is going to be enough to make the Americans come charging towards them. So they have to do it. If it's going to be a worthwhile opening, if they've got this concept of operations, how does it work? How does it make it worthwhile? How much makes it worthwhile? And realistically, if you're going to attack a fleet in harbour, like they were, yes, you score some torpedo hits because not all run down or run too deep, and some you drop from perfect altitude and they manage to still belly flop and run through the water perfectly. But you sink a ship by two means. By starting a fire which won't go out, or putting a hole in it that cannot be closed. Those are the two ways you sink a ship. Those are two ways you always had to sink a ship. Realistically, to my mind, if the Japanese had spent more time working on this, if they'd thought through the realities of their torpedo operations, they would have actually reduced the number of torpedo bombers they were taking onto this operation. Dive bombers make more sense. Especially if you're attacking on a Sunday morning when the ships are going to be lax anyway. Yeah, adding in that whole detail of attacking on a Sunday morning because the ship's crews are going to be lax, they're going to be, doing other, they're going to be either having a day off or going to church services. They're not going to be at mobilization. If you're doing all that, go for the fire kill. But they don't. They don't. And you get a juxtaposition throughout the design and planning process of this operation from the Japanese of a massive amount of intensive work and development and thought going into it. This routing, for example, to avoid enemy ships. And at the same time, you get gaps like their torpedoes, where they really don't. They really don't. Anyway, shameless book plug time, and after this it'll be looking at how the Americans would have done the attack. Now hello, and thank you for watching this channel. Thank you for helping the channel grow. I hope you're enjoying the video. I hope you're finding it an interesting take. I've done various videos about Pearl Harbor in my time, and I thought looking at the planning side of the operation would be appropriate for the year of leadership. If you like the videos, please do like, share and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow, and as this video is going to come out in the Christmas season, I'm probably making quite a big effort to try and to get to 20,000 subscribers, because there's probably a family bet on. It happens every year. It's a bet between my mother and her sister. I love them both dearly, but they are twins, non-identical twins, but twins, and they like to make familial honor bets, basically. It's things like my mum bakes a cake, my aunt will pay for a spa day for my mum, sort of thing. If they win, it's not money, it's nothing like that. It's literally more about family honor and bragging rights than it is anything. And yeah, it's currently if I get the YouTube channel to 20,000 subscribers. Who knows, I might have got there by this point, but I doubt it. But you never know. You never know. If I haven't, please help me. Please, just make my Christmas day easier. Thank you very much for your support. Thank you very much for liking, sharing, subscribing and supporting the channel, and I hope you're enjoying the video. That being said, let's go to how would the USN have attacked Pearl Harbor. Now, strange enough, we actually know the answer to this because they do it. They actually do it in two exercises. Admiral Harry Evan Yarnell does it first in 1932. And when I say he does it first in 1932, I mean he goes all out to do it first in 1932, and he does it well. There's a recent account I've found on the USN blog, and I've been saving it for, well, when I say recent, it was in 2011 it was done, but it's the US Navy's fleet problems of the 30s, a dive bomber pilot's perspective. And it's a really interesting read. You get to Fleet Problem 13, and it describes it this way. 1932 was an interesting year following the invasion of China by Japan. The scenario proposed that Hawaii had been taken over by an enemy, and the US Navy was dispatched to take it back. In a joint exercise, the Army played the part of the black occupying power, and our Navy the blue attacking force. Captain John Towers, Chief of Staff, planned to use the carriers Lexington and Saratoga to launch a sneak attack on the Army in Hawaii prior to covering landings by the Marines. On Saturday, February the 5th, the two carriers and destroyers formed a separate task force and left the main fleet, making high-speed runs into a launch position 100 miles north of Oahu. During the night, at dawn Sunday morning, the surprised army woke to the roar of fleets of aircraft attacking installations. Captain Towers had timed it perfectly. And the fact that Japan, this is the quote in there here, which I always find funniest, the fact that Japan nearly duplicated this attack on Pearl on Sunday morning, 7th December 1941, was no accident. Early in the 1950s, Towers dined in Tokyo with a Japanese vice admiral who participated in the planning. He told me they had simply taken a page out of our own book. Now, I think possibly there is some creative license going on there with the Japanese, because I have a feeling they noticed this one about the fact that the American Navy shut down on a Sunday morning a lot earlier than 1941 and a lot earlier even than 1932. But they certainly have it. They certainly have it. And this builds into my theory of if the US Navy had been planning to attack Pearl Harbor, again, you look at their results, and again, it's the same thing. It's an early morning strike. You know, Admiral King does the same thing in 1938 as part of Fleet Problem 19. Part of Fleet Problem 19, he does the attack. He launched a simulated attack on Hawaii, and you know, they carry out all their operations, and did well. They launched their attack from 100 miles away and hit the Army's Hickam and Wheeler airfields and Pearl Harbor Naval Station with devastating effect. That was carried out at 0450 hours on March the 29th. Now, interesting enough, March 29th was actually a Tuesday, not a Sunday. But that's why they attacked at 0450 hours. If it had been a Sunday, they could have gone in later with better light and probably done even more damage. So the fact is, the US Navy has two attacks to look at. Both scenarios involved, I would argue, a raiding strike focus, kind of like the Japanese. They are not necessarily the full carrier arm, they are not necessarily the full carrier capability of the US, but they are certainly a very capable force being used to do so, and do the strikes. And this is a problem for the US Navy. This is a problem when we start looking in history books, because they have these examples of what kind of force you need to attack Pearl Harbor, and when you attack it. And they don't listen. One of the surprising things to me is that over and over again I see the same mistake made, that it is assumed that to work out these gaps in your formations, you either need extensive intelligence information, you know, ideas of what your opponent's doing, or you need to be a military genius. The rules are more actually that you need to just be a professional and spend a lot of time studying something. Because you'll be amazed at how many times you can spot gaps in things if there's enough you looking at something and go, that doesn't work right. That doesn't fit. Why then, if the USN's plan to attack Pearl Harbor would not have been that great a difference, you know, judging by their previous experience of operations, why then are they not so prepared? Well, let's consider the criteria. You see, for the Americans, this is not about the opening act of a war. For the Americans, this is about responding to attacking, in the first case, for an amphibious assault. So it's about doing more than just a strike on the islands with aircraft. It's about paving the way for an assault by Marines. And so it's not the same thing. If we consider the 1938 exercises, well, to be honest, they're again a different scenario. They're about an ongoing conflict. And in an ongoing conflict, you can have your mass and you can have enough force to push through. And that's what they do. They don't expect someone to be coming at them with what was a couple of handfuls of destroyers, a pair of cruisers, a pair of, let's be honest, modernized battle cruisers, and 6 carriers as the opening move for a strike, for a war. It's too risky. It's too much exposure. Where's your safety net? Where's your protection? Now, even with that being the case, because of the experience of those exercises, people in the US Navy do think that there might be a chance of the Japanese attacking Pearl Harbor based on the information they have. A 50% chance is what the Admiral in charge of operations stated. Admiral Turner, however, made a decision. Information was not to be supplied to Pearl Harbor. They were not to be told what was going on, what was potentially coming their way, because, as has been happened previously, whenever they've been given the actual raw intelligence, or when they've been given full assessments like this, they'd started the commanders in of the Pacific Fleet and the commander of the Hawaiian garrison had started causing trouble and complaining. This is why those positions had been replaced and the current incumbents were in them, because their predecessors had caused so much trouble arguing with the White House. And you have to consider that they might have a concept of operations floating around, but also the Americans have a massive belief in themselves and a belief that the Japanese wouldn't dare attack their own territory. They were sure they'd go for the Philippines because that was not American territory, and who would dare attack American territory? There are so many issues with the American High Command in the run-up to World War II. The main problem I have with most of the conspiracy theories around them is they presume a level of functional intelligence and capability upon those leaders which I honestly do not wish to credit many of them with. I do not wish to credit many of them with. The thankful thing is that the Americans do clear house pretty quickly after war begins. And they do change their senior officers, and they do send Turner out to do things in the Pacific, where he does a fine job. He's just very much a political officer. He's very much Roosevelt's man. And he's very much more interested in the protection of the White House from having problematic senior officers on their hands, rather than making sure the Navy is well prepared for war. After all, he managed, with the White House's support, which is basically the quid pro quo, for operations to become dominant and take control of intelligence. He wasn't the head of intelligence, he was the head of operations. He managed to take over both roles thanks to their support. He needs to return that by making their lives as easy as possible, doesn't he? But yes, the US Navy had arguably at least 9 years warning that a strike on Pearl Harbor was a likelihood, and Sunday morning was a very good time to do it. And no one, even the commanders who'd come before Kimmel, had done anything about it realistically. They had hollered, yes, but they hadn't adapted their own forces. They should have done. If you've got a glaring weakness like that, and it's already been exploited in your exercises, you should go correct it. You need to go correct it. So, This is a fun one to look at. It really is. I like looking at the planning of Pearl Harbor and how the Americans would have done it and how the Japanese did it. The interesting thing to me with the Japanese plan is I'm fairly certain for quite a long time it was a raiding plan. They had a raiding plan as part of their initial strategy. I wouldn't be surprised if it was Akagi was usually the vessel plan to do it, and it's going to be a single carrier strike or something like that. And then it grows up into probably a multi-carrier operation to do enough damage to get the Americans. Because again, the attrition doctrine, and that's the big thing. The Japanese, to an extent, abandoned the attrition doctrine as part of the opener for war. They are, and the Southern Thrust and all these things feature into this to my mind, because if you were doing the attrition doctrine, you hit the enemy, you have them charge after you, and after you've whittled them down, after you've managed to have your decisive battle, your Kante-Kessen, then you do your Southern Thrust when they are weakened. And that is your coup de grace, which allows you to go and, show the world and get the negotiated peace you want and the level you want. Kind of like what they did with the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. But if you're not doing the attrition strategy, if you're doing an off-balance strategy, where you're going to try and hit the capital ships and the carriers in harbour, and take out as many of them as you can then, so you take out the core, the fighting core of the enemy fleets that are off balance, then you do the Southern Thrust simultaneously, or near enough simultaneously, so that you can secure yourself before they can build back. You've acknowledged, in a way, it's going to be a fundamentally longer conflict than you had been hoping for. There's a lot of interest going on there. There's a lot of interesting developments happening with the Japanese and others in this period. There's a lot of developments happening in terms of aviation. For the Americans, I realise that there are some measures. Some people like to point out that they have a thing of, this is not a drill, as one of their alarms. This is not a drill. Yes, and that is true. They did work giving out the call that it wasn't a drill when they were under attack. But the fact that they hadn't sorted things out, to the extent they had, the extent it was a case of, they have acknowledged this is a problem. They've had exercises twice which have revealed this is a problem, and this is a methodology of attack. The Japanese are not stupid. They're looking at the same information. They've come to the same conclusion. They don't need to copy the Americans. If the British had been looking at that information, trust me, the British air attack would have hit at exactly the same time. Probably known the British a couple of hours earlier while it's still dark, because they can do a night attack. They will probably hit about 1 or 2 a.m. in the morning after they've been drinking for the night before, on Sunday night, so that they are all asleep and all in bad condition, rather than, at full, even beginning to wake up, because the British can do night strikes. And this is the scenario here. The Americans have a operational weakness caused by culture. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's not a, someone manipulating events. There is some conspiracy going on, but it's not a whole thing to make it happen. It's just Roosevelt's government is upset with constantly being embarrassed by the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet and what he's been doing. And there will be a video there. I'm planning on doing a video about James Otto Richardson. Somewhere in the year of leadership, there will be a video about him. And he is the admiral we're talking about. When we're talking about an admiral who was Commander Battle Force US Fleet in 1939, who is kicked out of post because he's protesting that the portion of the fleet put in Pacific Pearl Harbor is not being properly defended. There are issues with Pearl Harbor. It's not being looked at. And B, this is more important, it's not able to defend itself. And he's using his access to the Japanese intelligence, to the information about Japan, is what he's using to make his case. And he is the acknowledged expert America has on Japan at this point. And he is kicked out of it. And then they decide to not inform his successors. And then you have the whole thing of, well, it's 50-50, but, Richmond Turner decides, I'm not going to tell them that, because I'm sure they'd never attack American territory. They'd never attack American territory. If they had had a warning that there was a 50-50 chance the Japanese were going to attack them rather than Philippines, might they have done something? They might have been on a better alert in the following day. They might have had more things stood up. They might not have been caught quite so napping. They might not have been caught in such a peacetime rhythm. The fact they were in such a peacetime rhythm worries me. The fact that we know that Halsey, etc. are going to sea and are immediately operating on wartime rulings, as Kimmel has got them doing, yet Pym in harbour is basically carrying on as if it's still peace. It worries me. The more I look into Pearl Harbor, the more I think the problem isn't Kimmel. There is problems which come from the political side, him not getting the information he needs. And you could argue that Kimmel hasn't managed to change the culture, and neither has his army counterpart, of their Sunday mornings being quite so lackadaisical. But the fact is that culture's existed for a lot of time. It even existed under Richardson. And he'd been the expert. He'd been trying to do something about it, but hadn't been able to, because it's so ingrained in the culture. So ingrained in the US Navy and the US Army culture in Hawaii that it's almost impossible to get rid of. And that requires the work of generations, but also requires the senior officers at all levels to be pushing it. Not just a few, but all of them. All of them to be pushing it. With that all being said, though, I have already mentioned the British. And I did do a little bit, decide to put some notes together for a bonus of how would the Royal Navy have done it? Well, the interesting thing is, if the Royal Navy were looking at a war with America in a serious light, then the fast oilers, especially the ones which are converted under Churchill's orders into amphibious warfare ships, because why would the Royal Navy need them? Would probably become in really, really handy. They do have some fast fleet oilers. They'd also be probably, if they're attacking Pearl Harbor, attacking from Singapore, as that's their fleet base, theatre entry base into the Pacific. I was considering would they be coming from the other side, but no. The other side would be home fleet, what they'd be doing. This would be where you'd have Med Fleet and all whatever forces it has would be focusing on from this side, if they're attacking from this side. And so, well, if we consider the whole planning of Med Fleet that goes into Taranto, and the sheer amount of information the British have, and the British do have war plans for America. They have them, like the Americans have war plans for Britain. It's professional courtesy. They're the two largest navies in the world. If they found out you didn't have a war plan for fighting them, they'd be insulted. That's the lovely thing. When I read some histories where they look at these things, they have plans, this shows their likelihood to go to war. No, it would actually have been an insult. It would actually have been an insult to them. The fact that the British at several points are wondering whether they should bother to work on the plan for war if the French go bad is insulting. It's basically saying, you're so not a threat, we don't need to plan or think about a war with you. We'll just wing it. That's what you're basically saying. If you're a major navy and you do not have a war plan or operational plan for that, a concept of operations for that scenario, being kept up to date, you are basically saying that person is so weak they are not worth my time. Because your job is not to worry about whether they're friends or foes. Your job is to be ready for if the worst happens, i.e. war breaks out. So yes, the British do have war plans, and the Americans have war plans for fighting each other in this period. I would presume, to an extent, they still have it to this day, but Considering how much the Royal Navy has suffered in recent cuts over the last 30 years, I could understand if it's no longer the case. They have some very good technology and some very good capabilities, but the depth of force is not there, and often the problems that come with the modern Royal Navy are people going, why don't you have this available? Well, because they were available earlier, and you stacked up so many maintenance issues by having them all available and surging them all for that and that and that. Now we have to deal with the consequence of it. And this is why you have the number of units you have. This is why you should have more than 6 Type 45s, and should be ordering at least 12 Type 26s, and probably at least 9 Type 31s and Type 32s each, and all these things. But yeah, that's a whole other debate and a whole other discussion. And I might do I've done an SDSR video this year, who knows. But how would the Royal Navy have done it? Well, if they're doing it in 1941, by that point they would probably be expecting to have at least Implacable, Ark Royal, Courageous, and Glorious. So if they were doing that, then those 4 carriers would probably be your core strength going out there, i.e. if war hadn't happened. Because if that was the scenario in 1941, those are probably the 4 largest carriers the Royal Navy has available. They probably take a couple of probably take Indomitable and another illustrious class, probably considering them formidable with them, and Unicorn. And why am I saying a 6-carrier formation? Why am I talking about a 6-carrier formation again? The Americans came up with the idea of how many carriers do you need to attack Pearl Harbor. Size fleet would be roughly 6 carriers. That's why they wanted 6 carriers for their war effort. That was where it came from. How many carriers you need to attack a major fleet base and do overwhelming damage. The Japanese had the same figure. And you'll never guess what Rear Admiral Admiral Henderson, when he was Rear Admiral Aircraft Carriers, came up with the figure of. Yes, it was roughly 6 carriers. The British were obsessed with multi-carrier operations, just like everyone else was. In fact, the British built their force around multi-carrier operations because, to include the survivability they needed to do in their carriers for operating in the Mediterranean and the South China Sea, which were key theatres for them, where they were going to be subject to humongous and ongoing air attack from land-based aircraft. They had to, under the treaty limits, they couldn't build the 27,000-ton carriers they wanted because they couldn't get enough of them under the cumulative limit, like the Americans couldn't. And so they'd had to compromise. The Americans had gone, well, we've got space for manoeuvre, so we can compromise on survivability of the carrier for air group and have more aircraft. And the British had gone, it's better to have some aircraft available than no aircraft available, so we've got to have the survivability of the carrier. That's why both nations, when you start looking at the carriers they would actually like to build once they're talking about outside of the treaty system, it's Midways, it's Implacables and Maltas, it's, all those sort of things. Those are what they would like to build. Ships which have a balance of protection and air group and are the full-rounded package. But yes, the British, if they've been doing it, it would probably been at least Implacable, potentially Indefatigable as well. It's going to depend. And Ark Royal, Courageous, Glorious, and probably 2 of the illustrious classes launching a strike, with Unicorn maybe in assistance there to provide them with the full air group support. The British strike would have been probably structured into 3 waves. It would have been launched at night, because the British know that neither the Americans or the Japanese are playing at night. They don't fly, they don't have the fighters up. They have some limited capabilities, but they haven't focused in on it like the Royal Navy has. The Royal Navy has been obsessed by it. Again, it's the whole thing of, it's the experience of World War I. For the Royal Navy, it was flying at night and night operations is a massive expense for a fleet air arm. Okay, it's a very risky prospect. It requires a lot of infrastructure investment, a lot of training investment, a lot of time to build it up. The British do it because Jutland, the Germans escaped at night. So it is an overwhelming criteria for the Royal Navy in the 20 years previously. For Japan and America, who hadn't suffered that, it's we'd like to have this capability, but we have to pay for other things. Because we have other hangovers from World War I. The Royal Navy is probably hitting about 2 a.m, 3 a.m. on a Sunday morning. They have the same intelligence. The nicest way, the Royal Navy ships, when they visited and done port visits to Pearl Harbor, remarked the same thing. They were looking around on a Sunday morning and going, where is everyone? Are we in a naval base, or are we in a holiday camp? There's some really interesting reports from the Royal Navy on their visits, and a few Royal Navy carriers go out to visit Pearl Harbor from the South China Sea, etc., during the 20s and 30s, and other ships go to Pearl Harbor, and every single time the reports come back, it's a case of, this place gets weird on a Sunday morning. So the British know that as well. The British know it, the Americans know it, the Japanese know it, everyone knows about it. They've known about it for over a decade, at least, by this point. So yeah, the attack probably goes in on a Sunday morning. The difference is, as I talked about before with the Royal Navy's torpedoes, they have that tension wire on their torpedoes. So they would drop flat. They would drop flat, which means they'd run into the ships. Combine that with dive bombers, which they did have skewers, and they were trying to develop better ones on that, and etc. And honestly, if you scale up Taranto, and you imagine the British carrying out that at that time in the morning on Pearl Harbor, yes, the Americans have air defenses. Yes, overnight their radar would possibly have detected them coming, but there again the British tended to specialise in doing a low-level, low-altitude strike, and those radars were not necessarily that good at detecting low-level aircraft. So they might not. They might not see them coming. They probably wouldn't see them coming, and you probably end up with an even worse outcome for the US Navy. Because the Royal Navy's strike aircraft are designed to round attacking harbours. They've designed their entire a lot of their policy, they fitted out their aircraft with a lot of extra things, extra weight. The tension wire system, for example, is extra weight, is extra stuff on the aircraft to attack fleets in harbour. You don't need tension wire for attacking ships at sea. You only need it for attacking fleets in harbour. So you're basically replacing the Japanese, who are doing it but haven't really specialised in it, with the Royal Navy, who have specialised in it. Because of Wilhelmshaven, because of Jutland, because of all the German fleet in being, all these things have had their bearing and effect on the Royal Navy's development. I think the US Navy loses their entire all their capital ships. But the thing is, what would be the impact overall in the war? Well, you'd still have the full might of the US Navy. It would still have the Essex Swarm and those things coming, but it'd be a whole interesting scenario. It would be a more devastating Pearl Harbor. It's interesting to think, would the Americans have been quite so complacent if their scenario had been the British versus the Japanese? I have to honestly admit, I think they wouldn't have been. I think there is unfortunately, especially in people in certain persons' mind, a racial element to how they're judging the Japanese and how they're projecting onto them and evaluating them. But there is actually a good chance they would have been. The Americans were a force which was, in many ways, whilst individuals like Admiral King, like Nimitz, like Kimmel, like Halsey were ready for war, and there were certainly a lot of officers down below them who were ready for war. There was a large majority of US officers who honestly couldn't get their mind around the idea there could be another massive war. they didn't think there would be. Because why? Why would anyone want to go through World War One again? Why? And that was it. Anyway, I always finish these videos with a question. I'm not going to change that now. So the question is this. And it's simple. It's an interesting one to think about, realistically. What do you think happens if the carriers are present in Pearl Harbor, but the capital ships aren't? And as I discussed earlier, they didn't launch the third wave largely because the carriers weren't. The whole reason they didn't have a third wave is because the carriers weren't there, so they didn't know where they might get attacked from. So they're not going to launch the aircraft. But if the carriers are in Pearl Harbor to be hit, but there are no capital ships, basically, let's say James Richardson got his way and he removed the things from the force which, frankly, he didn't think was safe and sensible to have there, and he couldn't really probably sustain. What happens? How does that change things? If all the carriers, all the available carriers of the Pacific Fleet are sitting in Pearl Harbor? With that being said, what have we got coming up? Well, when this comes out on the 7th of December 2025, we're going to be into the Christmas period. So, as I haven't yet finalized, because I'm still debating 3 other videos in that list, I have no idea to tell you what comes up. But I hope you're enjoying them, and I hope you're finding it interesting. Thank you very much for watching. If you like the video, please do like, share and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. And please, 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 20,000 subscribers. Just let my mum win one this Christmas. And let the bet be over. Let the bet be over. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Take care and have fun.